From the CISO Series, it's cybersecurity headlines.
Beijing-linked hackers penetrated U.S. Treasury systems, Chrome extensions hijacked for data theft, and Russian tanker suspected of undersea data cable sabotage. These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have selected from this past week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we're ready for some insight, opinion, and expertise from our returning guest, making his third appearance, Quincy Castro, the CISO over at Redis. Quincy, thanks so much for being here. And for being a three-timer now, we have a very special 3 gold stars for you. I don't know what general rank that brigadier, you're a brigadier guest, according to my lack of knowledge of all military ranking. So thank you so much. I have to ask, though, it was the New Year week. How was your week in cybersecurity?
So far, so good, but we never ever like to say that out loud here in the afternoon on a Friday. So
minimally terrible, yeah. I think
yes,
is the yes.
Minimally
okay.
terrible.
Well, also, before we jump into the news, I cannot wait to get into it, Quincy. Always a pleasure to have you on. We have to thank our sponsor for today, ThreatLocker, Zero Trust Endpoint Protection Platform. Remember to join us on YouTube Live. Do so, go to CISOseries.com, hit the events drop down, and look for the cybersecurity headlines week in review image. If you've never joined us, you get a chance to give us your thoughts on the news of the week, react to what Quincy and myself are going to be talking about, and throw out some questions if you have them. We always have a lively chat going. I already see Sean Kelly, CCL, and the big boss man, David Spark, having a good old time in the chat. So get in there and have some fun. Just a quick disclaimer before we jump into the news that these opinions are those of our guests, Quincy Castro, not necessarily those of Redis, friends, family, affiliates, or other loved ones. We've got about 20 minutes, though, so let's jump into it. First up here, Beijing-linked hackers penetrated the U.S. Treasury. Or Treasury systems, excuse me. According to a letter sent from the U.S. Treasury to congressional lawmakers on Monday, a Chinese state-sponsored APT was responsible for what is being called a major incident that compromised U.S. Treasury Department workstations and classified documents at the Office of Foreign Asset Control. We may know it as OFAC. The department has been notified on December 8th by Beyond Trust that a foreign actor had obtained a security key that allowed it to remotely gain access to employee workstations and the classified documents stored on them. The letter did not specify the number of impacted workstations or the kind of documents accessed. And the agency adds the compromised service has been taken offline, and at this time, there is no evidence indicating the threat actor has continued to access Treasury information. A longer read there, but important to give the context of where we are at. This is, a pretty big deal here. So, Quincy, this story might have gotten drowned out a little bit. It's a holiday week. Everybody's maybe taken off here, but it also seems to be pretty important given the term major incident was used, along with the standard plausible deniability phrase, there's no evidence that, et cetera, et cetera. I'm curious, do you have any further insights into what we know so far on this?
Yeah, so I don't have any unique insight into this campaign specifically, but it does sound really serious, right? And for those that don't know, OFAC, this is the office that's responsible for implementing U.S. financial sanctions against the country's adversaries, right? Arms traffickers, oligarchs, and yes, like cyber operations and influence operations organizations, right? I think we have a story about OFAC later on the show. So this is bad. And you can imagine why someone would want to be in here, the kind of data that OFAC has on its systems to allow them to go implement financial sanctions against these entities. So obviously a very targeted, focused intrusion, with a very specific outcome in mind, right? I think the larger picture here that's interesting is this is being made public right on the heels of the Salt Typhoon stuff. You had some major US telcos saying oh, hey, we finally kicked these guys out of our network. I think, with an adversary like this, everyone should just be very skeptical that, they've fully cleaned the environment unless they're really, really, really confident in what is taking place, right? And so, I think what's interesting to think about here is the larger political context for this, right? We have a new administration coming into office in the United States, a lot of China hawks in that administration. Some of the things I see in my news feed say maybe there's more willingness to pursue covert action. And so, now you've got these stories hitting the news where you've got, state-sponsored Chinese operators in pieces of critical infrastructure, in key components of the US government that are executing US policy. And I think watch this space, right? Because there's going to be pressure to do something about this, and TBD on what do is going to be here.
I'm glad you mentioned the Salt Typhoon stuff, because that's what stood out to me is, the anymore. The Salt Typhoon was so remarkable to me in that there was so much, we don't know if they're out, and then finally kind of coming clean, which is probably true of more breaches than we realize. But like the fact that that was transparent, and this they're coming out and saying, pretty definitively, like everything, everyone's out, this has happened, but it's, it's now contained. That really did stand out to me. And yeah, kind of this interim period of the change of administrations also striking, when we know it's, like there's just it's a different news cycle. There's everyone's on vacation, the very classic time to do these types of things. Obviously it's the reporting on this, the assault was, or the hack was taking place earlier in the month, but still, yeah, I wonder if we'll even see more stuff coming through. I know the inauguration is coming up, the switchover administration will be finalized at that point, but yeah, it definitely seems to be a spot of opportunity has been identified by a lot of these persistent actors. And CCL points out in our chat here, very targeted strike, shows a lot of sophistication. I mean, not surprising that, China or, name state actor is capable of this kind of sophistication. But yeah, this extremely targeted, and to your point, very valuable information as well. All right, next up here, Chrome extensions hijacked for data theft. The cybersecurity company Cyberhaven announced that on December 24th, it suffered a breach as a result of a successful phishing attack on an administrator account for the Google Chrome store. This resulted in at least 5 of its Chrome extensions being compromised by threat actors who injected information stealer code. Subsequent investigations revealed the campaign impacted more than just Cyberhaven, with at least 35 extensions collectively used by roughly 2.6 million people, which I checked, and that's a lot. So, Quincy, this is not just a Cyberhaven problem, but the outcome of this hijacking is the ability to steal user Facebook credentials and bypass multi-factor authentications, CAPTCHA mechanisms, a lot of the things that we say of, hey, have these implemented, and you should be, these are the baselines of defenses. A lot to unpack here. What's your take on this?
Yeah. So firstly, I mean, kudos to Cyberhaven for coming out and talking about this. I think this, to me, this is the right way to approach these kind of scenarios rather than the circle the wagons that you see with a lot of companies. This is a great story for a couple of reasons, right? First, I think it highlights how adversaries are getting creative to evade endpoint defenses. And as, kind of traditional tooling gets better and better, and hey, we're trying to protect, the laptops that our employees work on. Well, okay, how do I get my tools onto that system and go get the stuff I want and be able to continue with my operations? And, I was joking with someone like, this is almost like a B2C supply chain attack kind of thing,
I love that.
Cool. I think, somebody was thinking here in terms of like how to go get their job done. But, for CISOs, right? And certainly, this is something I've thought about. I think it's a great opportunity for security teams, particularly at tech and software firms, to think about how they'd respond to this kind of incident, right? If you are pushing apps to app stores, or if you're releasing plugins, or things that fit into other people's code, right? Like IDE extensions and stuff like that. Do you really know where all of those things are hosted and how your users pull those down, and who in the company is responsible for that stuff? And like, if you had to pull something out of an app store, like who can do that, right? Because the last thing you want to do is be in a hot incident where something like this is in the news cycle, and like the one engineer in the company who has the signing keys and has the permission to pull stuff out of the app store is like on vacation for 2 weeks and nobody can reach that person. So this is a great tabletop topic, I think, to run through if you're a tech company. And certainly this is one that, made me think a little bit about like, okay, how would we go respond to something like this at Redis? Do we know all the places that we would need to touch and things like that? So,
well, and I think as we've seen over this past year and a half of just this explosion of third-party data breaches, I love that analogy of B2C kind of attacks here, where, it used to be, hey, a lot of the concerns we have are, oh man, this is going to really open up something to attack the org chart, right? And increasingly it's no, we're attacking like these fundamental business relationships that we don't know the other side of those also as well. We don't have full visibility into them, and threat actors identifying those as real opportunities to prey on lack of communication, lack of standardization, that kind of stuff is really, this is just like the most one particular fascinating example of that.
Well, and I think the other interesting piece of this, right, is you look at what happened at like 23andMe and Snowflake with these like info stealer tools going after, end users of the product. And discovering, hey, in bulk, if you go out and hit a ton of these companies' customers, you can get a lot of credentials that you can use to pretty broad effect. And as now security tooling gets better to go after info stealers. Well, how do you go get that job done? Well, maybe I can get into the browser somehow and do it that way. And so again, I think it shows the traditional model for thinking about intrusions, and that kind of perimeter centric way of thinking isn't the only place that people need to think, particularly if you're in a business where you're serving, lots and lots of, kind of end user consumers that may not have the greatest controls on their systems.
All right. Well, speaking of interesting controls here, our next story here, Russian tanker suspected of undersea data cable sabotage. Authorities from Finland seized a Russian ship this week after it allegedly damaged several submarine cables in the Baltic Sea. The ship, the Eagle S, is an oil tanker that departed from a Russian port on December 25th, Merry Christmas, and is suspected of intentionally dragging its anchor for several miles, resulting in the complete severing of multiple cables, including the S-Link 2 power cable and 4 telecommunications cables. A report from the shipping journal Lloyd's List describes the Eagle S as being loaded with spying equipment unusual for a merchant ship and used to monitor NATO naval and aircraft radio communications and to drop sensor-type devices in the English Channel. So, Quincy, all the makings of a thriller novel here, to be sure. Not the first time that we've heard of Russians severing cables or initiatives taken to that effect, especially with its Baltic neighbors, always a potential hotspot. Given the reliance we place on data and power cables, this certainly qualifies as an infrastructure threat. What's your take on attack by anchor?
Yeah. So if somebody had asked me to make a movie of this, right, there'd be a scene of like someone with all this like robotic, remote control stuff on, and there'd be these like deep sea submersibles going in and precision doing this. And then it turns out like, no, if you want to be successful at this, just throw the anchor overboard, just drag it across a bunch of stuff and just destroy it that way, which is a little, unimpressive, but certainly gets the desired effect. Like I think about these things, I always think about like, how would I explain something like this to my grandmother, right? And I don't think the average person understands how inherently vulnerable the underpinnings of our digital infrastructure are in a lot of places, right? And whether it's undersea cabling, whether it's like BGP peering and stuff like that, and your ability to sort of influence traffic flows by messing that up, our digital economy, our sort of technical infrastructure that society increasingly depends on, is to a great extent still dependent on global norms and goodwill and good behavior. And so when we see things happen like this, and you look at the geopolitical tensions that are getting ratcheted up, you can see like, hey, there's a temptation to go out and break some of these norms, to sort of push the boundaries on stuff. If I drag it, hey, ship anchors catch undersea cables all the time, right? Like, this is a thing that cable operators are used to dealing with. Maybe I go out and just cut 6 or 7 or 8 of these things and just see what happens, right? And well, if nobody really does anything, maybe I do it again, and maybe I do it again, and it's kind of like dependence on low Earth orbit communication satellites, same kind of like vulnerable infrastructure that's sitting out there. And there are these norms around not messing with stuff in low Earth orbit because it can create a huge mess and mess up that space for everybody. But, desperate times push people to do things that are maybe not, hadn't been previously acceptable. So, look, I think at a technical sort of CISO level here, right? I'm sure there's a lot of people that saw this and are like, well, I have DR BCP plan, not a big deal, right? And if you're using CDNs and points of presence and all of that stuff, like, there's a technical fix and we're fine. And I do think in our community, there's a lot of people that go to that technical fix and just say like, oh, don't worry, I can take care of it. But, being at a medium-sized tech company, right? Like, we don't have the luxury of huge data centers, that we own all over the world to help us do this stuff. And so, I do look at this and I think this is not a technical problem for CISOs to go fix. This is more and more like an issue of global competition, right? And this requires thoughtful policy responses and kind of big brain international cooperation to go tackle. So, and yes, yeah, I think accident in quotes to CCL's comment here is a great way of thinking about this sort of thing.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, we always talk about that, right? It's like you only have to be successful once. I mean, it's like the cost of this attack is weighing anchor essentially, and to have that kind of outside effect. So yeah, definitely, while you can plan to be resilient in the event of this happening, the broader thing of we need some sort of international cooperation or policy that it's in everyone's best interest to maybe keep these lines open, or we would hope to build build a structure that would allow that. But yeah, that's a little bit outside of the typical CISO scope. So I appreciate that, Quincy, and that kind of perspective. And yeah, definitely something we'll keep an eye on for sure. Thank you, CCL, for that context as well. Before we move on to our next story, we have to spend a few moments with our sponsor for today, ThreatLocker. Do zero-day exploits and supply chain attacks keep you up at night? Worry no more. You can harden your security with ThreatLocker. ThreatLocker helps you take a proactive, default deny approach to cybersecurity and provides a full audit of every action, allowed or blocked, for risk management and compliance. Onboarding and operation are fully supported by their US-based support team. To learn more about how ThreatLocker can help keep your organization running efficiently and protected from ransomware, visit threatlocker.com. All right, next up here, Volkswagen software company Cariad suffers Amazon cloud breach. The breach was discovered by Europe's largest ethical hacker association, and it revealed that sensitive information for 800,000 electric vehicles from brands such as Audi, VW, and Skoda, all in the VW group, were left exposed on a poorly secured and misconfigured Amazon cloud storage system. The data stolen includes GPS coordinates, battery charge levels, and other vehicle status details, but experts warn that such data can easily be connected to owners through personal credentials, thanks to additional data accessible through VW Group's online services. So Quincy, VW has downplayed this incident, saying that the exposed data affected only vehicles connected to the internet and has been registered for online services. So I guess they were asking for it, and that data could only be accessed after bypassing several security mechanisms that required significant time and technical expertise. Last time I checked, though, time and technical expertise are two assets that cybercrime organizations generally have in decent abundance. I'm curious, do you find that companies, in an attempt to draw attention from damage to their brand, are turning a blind eye to the fact that, we're all fundamentally connected and increasingly so? Like, how are we to take this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this really stands in context to what we talked about earlier with transparency around, intrusions. Like, I find this story really frustrating. And I never want to victim blame in these scenarios, right? Because we don't have all the information. We're sort of seeing what's publicly out there. But what's out there is pretty frustrating, and to turn around and say, oh, well, the victims were limited to the people that just enabled the services we told them to turn on to operate the thing we sold them, feels pretty victim blaming itself, right? So, I look at this. And to me, the first thing that strikes me as a CISO is there's something fundamentally wrong with the corporate culture involved here, right? When you look at the response, it's problematic for so many reasons. They claim this is super hard to exploit. Clearly, that's not the case, right? Like this was exploited and reported about extensively. It's the customer's fault for sharing the data with us, but hey, we told them that they kind of have to do this to be able to use these services. And, we follow the law, but the law doesn't really know how to handle things like this yet, and if it's prescriptive in a lot of cases, such a minimal level that, it's never going to tell you, well, you have to protect S3 buckets in this way and things like that, right? And clearly, if you've got police cars connected to this service, if you've got potential intelligence officers and politicians enrolled in this service, either people didn't know what they were agreeing to when they clicked that box or whatever, or it wasn't clear what data were being collected. And so, look, I think ultimately this is an incentive problem that you particularly see with security of industrial systems, right? And so more and more services are needed to optimize and operate long-lived assets, whether that's trains or locomotives or gas turbines, wind turbines, that kind of stuff. And so in that context, right, like if you don't like the security posture of the vendor or something like this happens, it's really hard to walk away from that service because you own that thing and you expected it to last 10, 20, 30 years in the field, right? If you're a consumer, you can't just go out and buy a different car, or like buy a different HVAC system, or buy a different maybe you can buy a different air fryer, but
it's harder to rip and replace like a car that you've made a financial commitment to, long-term, financing for, that kind of stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so, look, I mean, people that know me know that I've been pretty skeptical around the idea that like the EU is going to be the world's like, rule maker and rule enforcer and that kind of thing. But I do think in this case, like you see the EU bringing, this new software liability regime into force next, 2026, I think, where they're going to hold people liable for vulnerabilities that cause damages to consumers, right? And to me, I look at this and I think, well, how do you get a company like Cariad to listen up? it's probably that kind of thing, changing the incentive structure so that they do take this stuff seriously and they don't fall back on blaming the people that enrolled in their services for the loss of their information.
Yeah, if anything, this shows me that either the carryout or the VW group incident response plan doesn't have someone with emotional empathy, maybe reviewing what they put out there, which is not to say on the one hand, I do sympathize, okay, maybe in the percentage wise, this is not a great number of people, or there is there is factual truth that doesn't also speak to human experience, which can be extraordinarily frustrating.
Right. And the one thing that really stood out to me is when you read the article here, it says that a whistleblower approached the Chaos Computer Club with this information, which tells me that someone was so frustrated. I mean, look, obviously people have their own agendas. Whistleblower isn't always a whistleblower, but let's take that at face value. Someone was so frustrated with the corporate culture there and presumably their inability to escalate this through some risk management process that they just went to an outside hacker group and were like, hey, look at this,
And this will be more effective, than anything internal. Yeah.
Right. And so, again, I come back to corporate culture and corporate leadership around effective security practices and giving people an opportunity to raise their hand and say, look, I don't think this is a good idea. We shouldn't be doing stuff this way. And imagine what a different story this would be if this had been exposed and the company came out and said, yes, that's true. It was for these reasons, and maybe they point to a risk management process and say, yeah, this was a known risk, but we needed to take this product to market. And so we thought that this was acceptable because it was obscured in this way. Right. Or, hey, we didn't know about this and thank you for letting us know, and here's what we're going to do to make sure this doesn't happen in the future, instead of pointing the finger at the customers and saying, well, it's your fault for doing what we told you to do. All
right, well, our next story here: large-scale supply chain attack using generative AI now possible, says researcher Crystal Morin, former intelligence analyst at the U.S. Air Force and cybersecurity strategist at SysDig, says she anticipates seeing highly successful supply chain attacks in 2025 that originated with an LLM-generated spearfish. This is because cybercrime groups know they don't need to train their own LLMs. They can just steal credentials and then jailbreak existing ones, which we know is pretty readily possible. She says that this is not pointing to a fully AI-generated attack leading to business operation shutdown, but instead the focus will be on more sophisticated social engineering campaigns. She calls spearphishing and social engineering her greatest security concern in 2025. So, Quincy, we ask this question very often on this show. What can be done to better protect organizations from social engineering, increasingly at kind of unknown scale that we haven't seen before?
Yeah. So I think 2025 should be the year that CISOs really make best friends with the head of their data teams and figure out what's going on over there, right? Because when I look at the article here and look at what they're talking about, right, it's all about credentials getting captured for LLMs by the users. Who are the users? Well, in a lot of cases, they're people that are hacking together POCs. They're data teams that are trying new stuff out, right? They're people that are operating outside, in a lot of cases, the normal kind of lines of business within a company. And I've talked to so many CISOs who say, yeah, over here with my regular production apps and all of this kind of stuff, I am really confident. But over here with the AI team that's piloting, some new chatbot, or the data team that's trying to do analytics on all this stuff that's sitting in our day, no idea. They've got their own tools. They do a ton of development locally. They're, in all of these services. And honestly, if you figure this is a hard skill set to go hire for just as a line of business, does anyone on the security team really understand what is going on over there, what these tools do, where these data are coming from? And in a lot of cases, if you go to, even security savvy IT teams and they're like, hey, what did you give the data team access to? It's I don't know. They asked for some API keys and then off to the races, right? So I think this is a place now, particularly as we see this explosion of work, racing towards AI adoption, where security professionals really need to get in this space, get in people's business a little bit, understand what's going on, not to disrupt it, in my own opinion, not to say no to stuff, but to figure out how do we put our arms around this a little bit and just help people move fast and get stuff done in a way that is secure, right? And stop, what's described here, which is just wide scale stealing of people's access credentials for very expensive services.
Yes. CISOs hug your CDO or whatever VP is in charge
or
of data.
High five. I mean, I don't know what your relationship is over
this
there.
Is true. This
Maybe
is true.
Fist bump,
fist bump, elbow, air five. Yeah. Whatever it takes. So yeah. If those if you haven't started that conversation, Yeah, 2025 is the let's make that your 2025 New Year's resolution. CISOs everywhere, please, please. All right, and our last story for today: Iranian and Russian entities sanctioned for election interference. On Tuesday, the U.S. Office of Foreign Asset Control, it's an OFAC sandwich here to finish it up. The very same office that was the target of the Chinese hack that we covered at the start of the show, leveled sanctions against Iran's Cognitive Design Production Center, or CDPC, quality name, folks, and Moscow's Center for Geopolitical Expertise, alleging these entities attempted to stoke sociopolitical tensions and influence the U.S. electorate during the 2024 U.S. election. I don't know if you're the Cognitive Design Production Center. I don't know what else I guess you're trying to do, but sanctions are sanctions. So, Quincy, there's almost every show where there's a story I have to look over my metaphorical glasses in a school marmy style. I brought physical glasses actually today. In this case, I'm also going to add, wait, what? Even if the Chinese hack is unrelated, I'm curious, do you feel these sanctions do anything other than gain some positive headline space? Not to take away from efforts of CISA and others that try to establish protections, but do sanctions of this type actually achieve anything beyond a slap on the wrist?
It really depends. And certainly if at the beginning of the show and you're still with us, you were like, what's OFAC? Here you go, right? Like, this is why people want to break in there. It so much depends on the nature of the sanctions and what they're trying to achieve, right? I think for some people, look, if you're hanging out in your country and you have no ambition to travel anywhere and you don't have any money sitting overseas, this probably is, not a problem for you, right? But if you're, 20, 30 something year old tech professional and you happen to work for your nation's government and you're engaged in this kind of stuff, or maybe you're, a private citizen and your firm has been hired to work in these kind of things. And hey, you go to FIFA stuff, you go to Paris, you go to Ibiza at a party, like it's not great being on these lists, right? And life starts to become harder and harder if you like to travel to, Western European and US allied countries. So I think it potentially is problematic. I think it's potentially problematic if you need to use the international banking system and the, at least today, like the arm of the US Treasury and its ability to influence people's like ability to have a bank account and spend money, like it's pretty long. So yeah, I kind of look at this as like, this is sort of the least, it's like the least worst, or kind of like the best way to do something that's really hard. And I think, you could have a whole show dedicated to like, with people way smarter than me talking about the effectiveness of financial sanctions and how do you create incentives to get people to stop doing the things that they're doing. And I mean, what we've seen out of like the FBI and other US, government agencies in cases around like Chinese intellectual property theft was like, let's just put pictures of people on notices and call them out by their true names and things like that. And they're, at least the people that work in those positions think there's a deterrent effect to just naming people and, talking about who they are. So, yeah, I don't know. I think, it sort of remains to be seen what happens here, but there's also a domestic element to this too. And I think it's good for, I'm an American citizen. I live in the US. Like, I think it's good for people in this country to see these things exposed. I think there's so much FUD about who are hackers, what are these things, is any of this stuff real? And so to be able to say like, here is a named organization, what does this named organization do? Well, it does these things through these channels to try to get people to line up with what the government of that country wants them to do. And so I do think getting this out there and helping educate populations more broadly is helpful, right? So
yeah, definitely. And CCL, yeah, to answer your, you kind of answered your own question in the chat here, but saying what is a sanction on an entity when the whole country is already sanctioned? Yeah, it impacts people associated that might be traveling internationally and that kind of stuff. I don't know how much that impacts Iranian officials, but certainly in Russia, that would have a very wide scope potentially for a lot of those people. And also, Quincy, I want to start a series that is not best practices, but least worst practices.
yes.
I think that as that'll be my TED talk for cybersecurity going forward. So thank you for that. Before we get out of here, though, Quincy, was there any story that was a thumbs up or an eye roller for you, either in the rundown or just kind of in the news of the week?
I want to dig more into the air fryer thing. I think that's fascinating. That wasn't a story we had today, but it's something that's been in my news feeds. And whenever people say consumer appliances are spying on people, like, all right, cool, like let's tear them apart and find that out. So more to come on that
And,
one.
well, we also had the Siri lawsuit settlement, of Siri, listening to you and being recorded and stuff like that. So, hey, it turns out all of things that we thought were paranoid fantasies, maybe less so. Who
No,
knew?
the part you never see in these kind of Black Mirror things is like when people choose to do it to themselves, right? I think that's the part that my younger self wouldn't have anticipated about the world we live in. So,
and that it potentially is like the most boringest reason.
why did you give all the tater? Well, I wanted tater tots made the way I like them. So, sure, yeah, here's my location and all of my personal information and stuff.
2% more crispy, for all my PII. I mean, you can't beat that. So yeah, so definitely. I mean, yeah, that'll definitely be. I don't think anything that's going to have the brakes put on any time soon. Well, Quincy Castro, CISO over at Redis, this was your third time on. We will definitely have to have you on for a fourth gold star level appearance. Thank you so much. This was phenomenal. Where can people find you online if they're so inclined to keep tabs?
I'm on LinkedIn at Quincy-Castro. Yep, there we go.
Yep, we'll have a link to that in our
yeah.
show notes.
Cool. And yes, we are hiring right now. Should have a new role posted Monday, I think. So yes, hit us up. Feel free to reach out.
And do you want to share your brand of air fryer in case people want to keep track of you that way?
So I don't have one is the thing. And so now we've got to do the whole TPRM review of the air fryer vendors and stuff like that. And, probably 6 months out here, we'll get to a decision. So.
All right. Well, thanks also to our sponsor for today, ThreatLocker, Zero Trust Endpoint Protection Platform. Thanks again, Quincy. This was just phenomenal. Always a joy to have you on. And we will have to have you on later this year because this was a blast.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks also to our audience for today. We can't get every comment up on the screen or address it during the show, but we really do appreciate you being here. CCL, of course, one of our regulars, always bringing a strong chat, but also Tim Christman. We had Sean Kelly in there and the big boss man, David Spark himself, dropping some MFA thoughts, which always appreciate that. Just a reminder, there'll be no Super Cyber Friday next week, but we will have another episode of the Week in Review show starting at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. To register for that, just head on over to our events page at CISOseries.com. If you join us live, remember, you can join in our chat, and we'd love to have you here. In the meantime, you can still get your daily news fix every single day through cybersecurity headlines. You give us about 6 minutes, we'll get you all caught up. Until the next time we meet, I'm Rich Stroffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOSeries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.